Thank you for stopping by. I am Jeffrey Weiss, your political activist, keeping you informed of local and world events. Today we discuss what Edward Snowden didn't tell us. If you think the government spying is due to the war on terror and the war on drugs, you would be wrong. I address the real problem in my book, The Patriot Betrayal. The following chapter brings the truth to light. CNBC News Studios, Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, 6 p.m. The studio lights came up on news anchor Lance McGuire. He shook out the kinks in his neck and shoulders, smiled, and signaled the lead cameraman that he was ready. There was a countdown from 10. The operator pointed a finger at the newscaster, and they were on the air. Good evening, viewers, Lance announced, tapping his pages on the desk to even them out. We have with us tonight Tim Underwood, senior editor at Wireless Magazine, who broke the story we're about to discuss. Welcome, Mr. Underwood, Lance said in his best baritone voice. Tim, please, the young man came dressed in a tweed jacket, white shirt, red tie, and faded jeans. He barely looked out of college, sporting a clean-shaven face, bushy brown hair that flowed over his collar, and riveting hazel eyes. His movements were lithe and swift, like a man in a hurry. Tim crossed his legs and opened his jacket. Thank you, Lance, for having me on, he said. His words ran together like they were in a foot race. In all, he expressed a sense of urgency. Let's get right to it, shall we? Lance suggested. Yes, of course, Tim replied. The young man was somehow uncomfortable in the present setting. He pushed back his hair that had fallen forward in his nervousness. Let's start with Stellar Wind. That's the code name for NSA's Utah data center. Its purpose is to intercept, decipher, analyze, and store vast swaths of the world's communications. Tim stopped for a drink of water, offered a strained smile, and then gave concern to the host, then continued. All forms of communication, including the complete contents of private emails, cell phone calls, and Google searches, will be scanned and stored forever. Wait a minute, Lance insisted. You're telling me and our viewers that this program could get inside our computers, our cell phones, our iPads, and credit card accounts and verbal communications, Tim stated flatly with the flip of a hand to emphasize the simplicity of the thing. The video cameras, so ubiquitous throughout the cities, capture not only your image, but enable computer-generated software to read your lips. Are you sure you haven't been watching too much sci-fi? Lance asked. I wish it were only so, Tim lamented, then reached for some water. While people busy themselves with texting, tweeting, surfing, and emailing, they're exposing their lives to Big Brother, revealing every secret that they thought was safe and protected. And it will be up to a very large, very cold and calculating organization to determine if U.S. citizens are a threat not to others, but to the system itself. Organization? Lance broke in. The government security agencies, the NSA, DEA, CIA, ICE, INS, Homeland Security, FBI. Those entities have reached a size where they are self-perpetuating. Their primary directive, if you will, is to maintain the jobs of the people, and the system's own demand for more power, more capabilities, become more intrusive, more indispensable. Indispensable to who? To those in power, naturally. But what's the purpose of all the spying, the new laws, the arrests? Lance asked. Control, Tim said. Control who? The dissidents. Dissidents? Lance asked. I'm not following you. The government isn't worried about Al-Qaeda or Islamofascists or ISIS. The war on terror is trumped up to give the federal government and the states a reason to introduce more laws and enforce them more strictly. They spy on groups, learn what they are planning. They've infiltrated the groups with FBI, ATF agents, or with paid informants. If the groups are non-violent, they foment violence. They destroy the group's credibility and ability to gain traction. You see, the government, or the men and institutions behind the scenes, greatest fear is the people themselves. The banksters and the corporations have taken just about all they can from the public. When citizens have nothing to lose, they revolt. The American people are very close to that now, and the closer they get to being destitute, disillusioned, demoralized, the more laws, the more manpower the government's going to need to control them. Look at what happens in Latin America, Lance, Tim went on. When there's an injustice, a cause celeb, people gather in the thousands, tens of thousands, in front of government buildings to protest. They're basically shut down the country until their voices are heard and the government acquiesces. They have nothing to lose, nothing left for the government to take from them. America is really close to that event horizon. Tim seemed parched despite an effort to stay hydrated. The young man looked over the top of his glass while drinking, never breaking eye contact. He used great care to set his water back down, then went on. There was a time when Americans still cared about matters such as privacy. Luckily, they now have gadgets to keep them distracted as they hand over the last pieces of individuality to the czar of conformity. You sound cynical, Tim, Lance said. I wish I had better news. Held out more hope, but, Lance repeated. Tim hesitated, staring at his glass. The news anchor nudged him. Please go on, Tim, the host suggested soothingly. Yes, under the circumstances, we'd need to organize on a massive scale to counter the forces aligned against us. But there are laws to protect us from people or organizations that step over their authority, Lance insisted. Government and quasi-government agencies don't just follow the laws. Due to the fear they generate, the power they wield, they actually write the laws. That's what they're doing, have been doing since 9/11, Tim said, thinking he had explained himself fully. Yes, Lance agreed, laws to protect. No, laws to prosecute anyone who speaks or acts against the government. Why would they do that? Monitoring isn't enough? It's to discredit and destroy those groups before they can become a force for change. Tim held his thumb and forefinger close together. We are, like, that far from a turnkey, totalitarian state. He then sat back as if he'd rather say no more. He started to pick up his glass again, but his hand began shaking and he spilled water on the table that quickly found its way to the floor. He started to pick up. Lance leaned forward slightly. You look uncomfortable, Tim. Is anything wrong? He asked, more personal than professional. When you expose or criticize the government, you open yourself up to attack. Those attacks may be smear campaigns to besmirch your reputation, or more intrusive, like stealing your mail or what, Tim? Any more would be speculation, he replied, in a way that conveyed it was not speculation. Please go back to your account. Lance reached out to give the young man a reassuring touch on the shoulder. This story broke when former NSA operative Martin Downey, a senior analyst, quit his job after he realized that the agency was openly trampling the Constitution. In case you haven't been following the news, that's the same Martin Downey who was killed when his plane went down over the Atlantic last week, just 4 hours after he was interviewed by Rolling Stone magazine. This keeps getting worse, Lance concluded. Are things so bleak we can't work out our way out of this? What we've discussed here is just the tip of the iceberg, Tim assured. Was there anyone else associated with Stellar Wind that died or disappeared as a result of their willingness to expose the program? Lance asked, trying to get the answers he and his viewer wanted, but still be sympathetic to his guest. Yes, several, Tim replied. He made it sound like a warning. And their deaths were suspicious? That depends on your level of incredulity. Do I detect a hint of sarcasm in your voice, Tim? It's that obvious, Tim said, not trying to hide that in the least. Okay, we'll leave it there and go on. How is stellar wind going to affect our lives? After all, we're law-abiding citizens with nothing to worry about. It's terrorists they're after, right? The definition of what constitutes an American citizen is narrowing. Anyone who doesn't agree with the administration, any dissident, marcher, protester, anyone demanding their rights under the Constitution, are threats to be sequestered. Sequestered? Lance asked. I'm not sure I understand the context. Controlled. A polite way to say imprisoned, or yes, or what? You'll have to use your imagination. When I do that, it's like looking down a black hole, Lance said. Yeah, pretty bleak, Tim responded. There were 7 people who did or were going to blow the whistle on the NSA. 5 of them are dead. I'd say there's a lot to be worried about. Can you tell us who the others are? No, Tim said so emphatically that it forced the anchor to jerk back in his seat. And you're saying our elected officials are behind all this? Lance suggested. It's hard to fathom. Our elected officials are mascots of Wall Street oligarchs and puppets of corporate plutocrats. That's quite an indictment, Lance responded. Power always thinks it has a great soul and vast knowledge beyond the comprehension of common citizens, and that it's ensuring the Constitution when in fact it's subverting its laws. But isn't fighting the war on terrorism vital to the nation's security? Those programs are to track and capture terrorists, Lance insisted, tapping his pencil hard against the top of the desk. The war on terrorism is trumped up to scare people into giving up their freedoms. But there are terrorists out there, aren't they? It just depends on your definition of terrorists. Do you think people in the Occupy movement are terrorists? Lance thought for a moment. Of course not, he decided, after considering the position of his station as well as his own opinion. Well, the Department of Homeland Security thinks they are. An independent journalist who follow police and photograph acts of violence against demonstrators, and people who complain about the contaminants in their water, and those who go out on strike against unconscionable working conditions, and every whistleblower, even those uncovering war crimes, they're terrorists. From what you're saying, anyone could be a terrorist, Lance concluded. That's exactly what I'm saying. If my articles interest you, please use the link to check out my website and books. Thank you very much.